Good. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So how did you actually get into painting in general and painting Middle Earth in particular? What inspired you to start this channel?
Well, I watched Bob Ross growing up. He'd come on once a week and I'd watch it. And I always wanted to oil paint. But my my dad was a teacher and my mom was a stay-at-home mother. And can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Um, so I asked if I could get some oil paints. My mom asked how much they were, and uh, I threw out a number. I didn't know. I was probably 8 years old, but it was too expensive. And she told me I had some Crayola I could work with. Um, but So I learned a lot by watching him, but I never really put it into practice until about 6 years ago or so. Um, Bob Ross came on Netflix, and I was excited, and I told my daughter this was great, and she was kind of throwing a fit. And pretty soon she was really quiet, and I looked over at her after about 10 minutes, and she said, "Bob Ross is amazing." So I said, you know what? I'm going to go out and get those oil paints. I'm going to start. And that's pretty much how it started. And of course, I'm a huge Tolkien fan. So uh, the thought of what I was going to paint, because I live in Florida where it's relatively flat and no mountains and there's beaches, but so I decided painting Middle Earth would be the best way to go. And then the phrase "the joy of painting Middle Earth" just kind of popped in my head, and the channel was kind of born in my imagination.
Mhm. And how did you come up with the character of Timbo?
Well, Tim being my name, a lot of times I have friends that call me Timbo, so it sounds very hobbitish anyway. So I kind of created um, my own lore for Timbo, because in the appendices of uh, Lord of the Rings, Samwise's daughter uh, um, marries the son um, of Pippin, and and then they have, and Pippin's son is named Faramir the First. It never says what their children's names are. So I thought, well, if it's Faramir the First, there's got to be Faramir the Second, which would be a grandson of Pippin and Sam. And I thought, well, he'd be first in line for the Thane of the Shire. Faramir the Second would. And then every royalty has to have a little brother who doesn't have quite the responsibility. And so I came up with Timbo-Took, the second son of Faramir-Took the First, and then the idea of Bob Ross coming to the Shire, teaching all the hobbits how to paint, and then of course Bob Ross always wore blue, and hence the Blue Wizard, which we never really got to see in the books. So Bob Ross is the Blue Wizard who comes to the Shire and teaches us all how to paint.
Yeah, so that's a nice story. And as you mentioned that you are living in quite a flat land, so where do you come up with the inspiration? Do you take inspiration in an already existing Tolkien art or the famous artists like Poe and the others, Lee?
Yes. Yeah, there are. I've enjoyed since I was a kid. First time I saw anything Lord of the Rings or Hobbit was the Hobbit animated movie in the 70s. Um, I watched that. That's where I was first introduced to Tolkien, and then I read the books once I got a little bit older. And I had seen Alan Lee's and John Howe's work, and Ted Naismith and many of the other ones. And so when I paint, my inspiration is either, a lot of times I'll go to the book and I'll read the descriptions that Tolkien gives of the area, the scenery, uh, and paint off of that. Sometimes, because everybody loves the images from the movies, I'll paint those. But usually I make a distinction. If I'm painting from the books, I'll say this is a story from my grand gaffer Gamgee, who would be Samwise. And if I'm painting something from the movie that wouldn't quite be in line with the way it was in the books, I say that this was my grandpappy Took after he'd have too much in his cups at the Green Dragon. He'd tell stories like he climbed the tower and lit the beacon and this sort of thing. So if it's from the books, it comes from Samwise. If it's from the movies, it comes from Pippin.
Nice division. Okay, so now let's talk about Tim Sullivan as a person a little bit. You do this as a hobby, I assume, yeah? So
yes.
How do you manage your time? How do you maybe organize that so that you have time for painting and for actually doing all the administrative work around your channel?
Yeah, it's well, this year has become quite busy for me, and I haven't put out as many paintings this year. But typically, I'll paint on a Saturday afternoon, or in the evening maybe. I paint on the weekend, and then usually I take it takes about 2 hours between setup painting. The painting takes about an hour or so, 45 minutes to an hour, and then clean up. And then during the week, I'll sit down at my computer in the evenings and just kind of edit it together, zoom into some spots, and just put the episode together. So I kind of squeeze it in between. I have 4 kids, and I work in commercial insurance, which in Florida we've just dealt with a few hurricanes. So that's why that's been part of the reason I haven't been posting as much recently. But it is a hobby. I just have a ball doing it, and it's really it's I look at it as performance art as well as art on the canvas.
Yeah, so it creates kind of a balance between the work life and really from the stuff that you do as for your job, and then you have this kind of relaxation. Or
Yes.
is it? Okay. My next question was that besides Middle Earth, if you paint anything else, maybe for your own enjoyment, something that doesn't get to be on your channel, or for the request of your friends or family.
Yeah, I've done a few other paintings, some Harry Potter, some Star Wars, and it's been more at the request of some others, or just kind of having a little bit of fun. But for the most part, just because of time, I usually don't practice a painting. I just set up my camera and go. There's a few that sometimes the sound wasn't working, and so I had to repaint it. But for the most part, if it doesn't look good when it's done, that episode never makes it onto YouTube.
Also, are there a lot of fails that never made it to your channel?
There's probably been about 5 out of 95 episodes, and then I've done a few live streams. But yeah, so there's been some, and most of them have been technical difficulties. There's been 2 that I just went, no, that didn't look as good as it did in my head.
So that's pretty good that it's only 5 out of those many. Okay, my other question was that if you actually make any commissions, like on purpose for maybe, I don't know, if people from YouTube or from our other social media that you use, they contacted you that they would like to buy something from you specifically painted for them.
Yeah, I've only done a few. Just again, I'm not really a professional artist, and I will make prints from some of the paintings from the episodes, and I have a link where I sell those, and that really it brings in enough to buy more paint and more canvases, but it just kind of, it's a hobby that supports itself. But it's more done just, just to entertain people. So I haven't done too many commissions.
Yeah. And do you dream about doing something big, like illustrating a book or something like that?
Not too much. I've written a children's book that I'm working on with a friend right now, but he was actually a Disney animator. So his level is way above mine, and he's done some fantastic drawings. But so I write as well as paint, and I've published a couple of novels, just not in the realm of Tolkien or anything like that. They're more military action thrillers. I was a diver on submarines in the Navy, so that kind of experience goes into my novels, and then I just have my painting. I haven't really mixed the two as far as illustrating a book or anything like that, but it would be fun someday.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I'm not a rigorous watcher of your series. I also don't have much time due to all the things that I do at the university and so on. So I'm not sure if your fans know that you're a novelist, so to say.
Not really too much. I mean, it's not something I put out there on the series all the time, just because I'm in character. In fact,
Yes, of course.
Even some fellow YouTubers, we had a group chat going for almost a year, and before one of them realized the hair in the video isn't even my real hair. I was like, that would be some pretty fantastic hair if I had that big hobbit mullet walking around every day.
Yeah, it was. That's why I mentioned it, that it was surprising for me as well that you mentioned that you write novels. So maybe one day I'll get to read something from you. That would be interesting to see.
Well, and again, my writing is probably about as on par with my painting. It's a good hobby, but I'm not writing the next great American novel.
Well, if it's as good as your paintings, that it's better than, I believe, 80% of all us like regular people.
Thank you.
Okay, so talking of that, do you have like any dreams of maybe making a collaboration with somebody, some famous Tolkien artist, or maybe some novelist, as you mentioned it already?
It's funny. I've done a few of those Comic-Con shows, where I set up a booth and that sort of thing, and really my big kind of dream for that would be for the gentleman who played the hobbits to be able to see my work and my act, as you would. So and as far as collaborations go, I've done a few, like on YouTube, on other YouTubers channels, where they'll be talking about Tolkien, and I live stream painting on their channel, and that's been fun. But it ends up being just kind of a small window on there, so you can't really see the paintings very well. But it's fun just to kind of hang out and be part of the conversation when I do that.
Okay, so we wish you that your dream comes true. And that brings me to question: do you know each other with Emily, or at least from like social media or something like that?
Do I know Emily? I've seen Emily's work, but I think this is the first time I've seen her in person.
Same. Well, I've seen a bit of your stuff before, Tim, but yeah, it's the first time really seeing you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you.
You too.
I'm happy that I was able to introduce you. Okay. Yeah. Maybe you didn't see the previous sessions that we had today. The focus of this colloquium is on literature and its relationship to visual art, illustration, or other forms of art. So what is your personal opinion on this, particularly on the relationship between illustration in books and text? Do you think they are like enhancing the reader's imagination, or on the other hand, do they limit the reader's imagination?
Well, I think it comes down to the reader themselves. I have some friends that read and don't really picture anything as they read. It's just kind of the words going in. And so for them, artwork and stuff to go along with it, or something that's made into a TV series or a movie, that enhances their experience. I always like to read a book before I see an adaptation, or art in the book is fantastic. I love C.S. Lewis's books and Tolkien's little art pieces in there. But I normally like to read it first and create my own visualization. But I don't think it takes away because everybody's experience is so individual. But I always, whenever I watch something or see illustrations of something, it's like, oh, that's not anything like I pictured that person. But Tolkien does a good job with describing everything and everybody so perfectly. A lot of those, when I see them, in particular the hobbits and Aragorn.
And when you're reading something, do you imagine how you would paint it?
Yes, but usually my imagination of how I could paint it and how I can actually paint it are there's a bit of a chasm there. A lot of times I'll sit down, I'll have a grandiose idea, and it ends up, it looked so good in my head. But it's always fun though to take something like that. Tolkien describing a mountain that's stuck up like a tooth, a visualization like that. I can see the peak of the mountain and know exactly how I would paint it like that. But yeah, I do, as I read now. I mean, I didn't before, but as I said, painting is probably a newer hobby in my life. So now I really do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that happens to most of us, that we imagine it in a different way. And since most people don't have as good a painting skill as you, it turns out even worse than imagined. What's then your response to the films? As you said that you first read the book and then you rather watch the film afterwards. So are you sometimes surprised positively or negatively, or when the visual comes to life on screen in comparison with your imagination?
A lot of times I can be a little disappointed. But as far as the Lord of the Rings trilogy went, I don't get stuck in the dogma of this is how it's supposed to be. I look at it as somebody else's interpretation. I mean, I do the same thing with my paintings. I'm interpreting what somebody else did, so I'm not really there to criticize. But like with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I was blown away because I thought nobody would ever be able to pull it off quite like they did visually. It was just between that and the music. I love the music from Lord of the Rings, and that usually plays in the background for me most days. So just bringing those emotionally binding things together, the visuality, the music. So just a huge fan of those films.
Yeah, we were discussing it previously in the sessions, that how every reader can have a different experience of the world and therefore imagines things differently, and that works for the creators as well, that they create it in such a way as they envision it based on their experience. So yeah, the Lord of the Rings creators, they make pretty good job, and also the nature in New Zealand, it provided beautiful
Yes.
settings. And talking of illustration or paintings, do you think that painting itself can bring people to reading? Or have you had any such experience on your channel that people wrote you that you inspired them to actually take the book and read it?
Yes, actually, I've done some live paintings for kids in in schools, and that, and from there it has sparked an interest in reading, and a lot of times it's parents reading to them because they're a little younger when we do these. I've done the paintings for them, but that's part of it too. Is it really? I was so entertained by Bob Ross and his painting when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, that's when I created this. I was really thinking of it more as the kid who's sitting there, the child who's sitting there, watching it and just being immersed both in painting and in being inspired to read. And I have received comments on my channel where when the episodes come out, one mom had written me, for her kids, it was like those Saturday morning cartoons growing up. And I know it's with the invention of cable TV and cartoons all the time. When I grew up, it was just, you had one shot a week to watch some cartoons. And but in having it, my episodes equated to that experience of the once a week, that joy that came, that was really special to me.
Yeah, that's lovely. Okay, so that seems that were all of my questions that I have prepared before. Maybe if you would like to introduce those pictures we can see behind you.
Yeah, I have, of course, Gandalf fighting the Balrog. Let me see if I can bring this closer. So this one was a favorite there, and I painted lightning for the first time on this one, and I hadn't done that before, and it turned out better than I thought it would, so I was happy about that. And then let's see, I've got this one. This was Helm's Deep. See if I can get the glare with Aragorn and the wall broken, and we have the Uruk-hai back there coming in. I did this one as an episode, but it was as a request for a friend who's in Ukraine, and this was back in April earlier this year, and he was dealing with the invasion in their hometown. He requested that I paint this, and so I did that one on an episode for him.
Yeah, that's
And then
amazing.
this one back here on the easel there, that's from the Rings of Power series that just came out. This is what I call the Fordor turning into Mordor. So so, and I just have paintings all over. I just pick them up off the floor. Again, another image. This was from the Rings of Power. They're just glimpse of Sauron.
Do you have
So
a favorite one? Paintings?
the Argonath is my favorite visualization. It always was. Reading it, I just, the grandiose statues I thought would be fantastic. And then when I saw it, I saw it in artists' renditions before the movies ever came out, and then I really thought Peter Jackson in the movies had nailed it, with the exception of having a sword, not an axe. So when I painted it with both having their axes.
Okay, so thank you for the interview. It was nice to have you here. And now we can move on to Emily.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Okay, so hello, Emily.
Hi.
Similar like with Tim, I have a short recording of your work. Basically, I just recorded what you have on your website. So I'm going to play this clip now. Also, our viewers can then have a look at your websites and buy something. So as you could see, Emily is an artist of a broader scope, not only painting and not only Middle Earth, but also other topics, and as well as photography. And yeah, this is one of the things that we discussed online in a chat, that through your page, people were able to buy also like pieces of jewelry with your pictures in it, but that is actually a collaboration between you and some of your friends.
Yes.
So many of the questions I'm going to ask you will be pretty similar to what I asked Tim. So maybe we can start with your artistic beginnings. How did you get to doing what you are doing?
Well, I became interested in visual art from a young age. I took a lot of art classes as a kid and just kind of kept on going. I was lucky that my parents were pretty supportive in seeing this as potentially a career, and so they let me take a lot of classes. And then I majored in art in college and graphic design as well. So I worked for several years as a graphic designer for a few different companies. And then I struck out on my own to do visual art a little bit more full time. I was also doing a master's degree at the same time, but yeah, so
You are a professional artist.
I suppose you could say that.
Having the education. Okay, so maybe try to describe your typical day as an artist, or how much time do you spend on doing what you're doing? Maybe explain a little bit.
Well, I usually have some orders to ship from my Etsy store, so that's a significant amount of the time I'm spending. I hand print many of my pieces that I sell there, so that requires, like loading special paper, making sure that it's produced correctly and consistent with how I want it to look, as close to the original as possible. I'll also probably often be working on some sort of commission or requested project, and so I'll work a little bit on that most days. And then if I have extra time, I'll usually try to think of something else I want to create based on something I've read, or a scene that I've been thinking about for a while.
So is it hard for you as a self-employed artist to strive in USA?
It's challenging. If I wasn't part of a two-person household with two incomes, I probably wouldn't be able to do what I do. But I have a very supportive spouse, and I do take over a bit more of the home projects, and keeping things clean and everything, just because I'm here and have a little bit of a less demanding schedule. But between the two of us, I think we're pretty happy, and it's been nice to be able to spend a few years getting things off the ground, as far as being more exposed as an artist, having people approach me. So I have a little bit of a bigger client base now, and I'm able to continually adjust, change prices as I get a little more well-known. As far as original art goes, especially, a lot of that depends on just the amount of requests you're getting, and do you have enough time to handle it all? And when you get a little too busy, it's time to change your pricing structure to account for that.
Yeah.
So the time has been helpful, of just having the space to do that over time. But without that, I probably wouldn't be doing this to the extent that I am.
And I noticed that you are quite popular within this Tolkienist community, and your art is also displayed in this year's Tolkien calendar, and you illustrated some books or designed covers.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to be connected to the Signum University community, and that is how I've made a lot of those connections with other Tolkien lovers and scholars. I'm currently working on a few illustration projects with Signum University, and a few others through people that I've met through them. And so that's been a wonderful source of just being able to get the word out that I'm looking for collaborative projects. And I really like those combination of my academic interests with my artistic interests.
So which of these things that you do, painting, photography, and maybe design, which is your favorite to work on?
That's difficult. It sort of depends on the situation. I would say I absolutely love painting, and it's always probably what I consider, I don't know, maybe the heart, but everything else that I do interests me as well and sort of supports that. So like photography, I often am interested in taking photos in order to then use them later as references in my art. So I'll often kind of just have landscapes that I've visited, bring one of those photos as a reference to put in the background of a painting or something, to help add to the realism. I think there's a difference when you've actually stood in a space and experience what it felt like to be there, and you can bring that into your creation. Not that you can't just use another reference. I do that all the time as well, but I do think it feels different, at least from my perspective as the creator. So photography feeds into the fine arts, and then graphic design work just provides my brain with a different type of challenge. It's a nice change.
I've actually ordered some years ago a couple of your postcards, including the Inklings' favorite location, the Eagle and Child.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was possibly one of those based on your real visit in a place. Or
Yes, yes, definitely.
I love Oxford so much. It's such a beautiful city.
Me too. Yeah, it's a great place.
And what are your favorite subjects to paint?
I tend to gravitate towards landscapes. Fewer portraits, although I've tried to stretch myself in the last few years and do a few more. But especially if I find I have to choose one or the other. So I want to do a figure that is the image is focused on the figure, maybe just a head and shoulders sort of thing. And then if I do a landscape, I don't really want to have to worry about bodies also moving through the landscape quite so much. So I like to just choose one thing and go for it. But landscapes are definitely what I do the most.
Do you have your favorite picture painting?
Oh, that's very hard. That's hard to say. I like a lot of different ones for different reasons.
An example?
So, well, you mentioned Oxford. I liked painting some Oxford scenes. There's one that I did of nighttime in Oxford. And I like that one because it required just a different exploration of color because of the transition from day to night. It was sort of a dusk time period. And so it was a good challenge, but I think I pulled it off well. And that was one that I based off of a photograph that I had taken as well. So yeah, that's definitely one of my favorites.
And so what was the thing with the necklaces or the jewelry that you were offering through your website or Etsy?
Yeah, that was just someone I know who works for a local small business thought, hey, this could be a good thing for you to collaborate with. And so basically I give them the artwork, they create it for me at a wholesale price, and then I sell it through my website as a complement to my other work. So it's pretty simple, but just another way, I think, for people to experience the work.
Yeah. So it's more practical to have like a necklace or a ring to wear as a sign of your fandom or something.
Yeah, very possible, especially if you don't have a lot of wall space.
Yes. And you want to show off to your friends.
Yeah.
As I was reading the information on your website, I found the following quote: "A voracious childhood reader, I grew up getting lost in stories and fictional worlds. Sometimes I try to draw the fantastic scenes which authors conjured in my mind. I've never stopped wanting to participate in the stories I encounter on pages by bringing a visual contribution to their worlds." So my question related to that quote is, as you mentioned, you've collaborated on some book illustrations and something like that. So do you have any dreams in this way, this direction?
Well, I'd say a lot of the pieces that I do are rooted in that impulse when I'm reading to visualize something, kind of like what Tim said. Oftentimes what I picture in my head doesn't actually make it out onto the page quite the same way, but especially if a certain scene has really been sticking in my mind for several years, I will try to get it out eventually. And it may mean doing a few sketches one year and then picking them back up and turning it into something more a couple of years later. But I am working on a few book illustration projects at the moment. Those are a little bit more academic focused, or they're not necessarily stories that I'm illustrating. It's more like one of them is for the Prancing Pony podcast. Those guys are writing a book. And so my illustrations will be Tolkienian and Middle Earth related, but it's specifically for their book. And sometimes those projects are helpful because, one, you have a time limit, and you have someone else that you're actively collaborating with. So I think that all art is to some extent a collaboration, but when you have another person that you're actually working with, it can be very energizing.
And is there any specific literary work that you would like to illustrate in the future? Maybe some of your favorite books or something like that you would like to recreate?
Oh, something I've been thinking about for a while is doing some illustrations of the work of George MacDonald, who is a Victorian fantasy writer and just kind of more plain fiction writer. But his work, for one, is no longer under copyright, so I could actually make like a book and create the illustrations for it, and produce it myself. So that's attractive, but it also would require a big chunk of time to devote to that one very specific project. So it's been in the back of my mind for a while, but I'm sure I'll also continue to illustrating Tolkien's world, because that's something I feel at home in. Kind of like Tim, I feel a lot of joy just being in that world and exploring it through all these little nooks and crannies, especially like scenes that haven't really been depicted quite so much, or by not by the big popular artists. I like finding those underutilized passages and bringing them to life.
Excuse me, there was also a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we have a question in the chat. To what extent the symbolic component of pictures is when creating them? So it's possibly a question for you, maybe.
I would say I usually don't actively think about incorporating symbolism. Maybe if it was very integral to the original passage of text that I wanted to illustrate, but it would be very project dependent. I wouldn't say that I'm interested in putting a lot of symbolism directly into my work personally.
And what about using photography for illustration? Haven't you thought about maybe using
I certainly think it would be possible. But I would say the closest thing that I've done to that directly is using photography to set up a scene, which I then want to turn into a painting. So I've done that a few times. And I think a lot of artists do that, where they'll create kind of an approximation of what they want to paint, and they'll photograph it or have it in front of them, and then use that as a reference, as a guide to get the shapes right, and develop the idea more thoroughly.
Yeah. So it's a technique not commonly found in books. That's why I included this question.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I would say, I'm sure some people do like use photography as sort of like the start of a collage medium or some other mixed media. And you could definitely do some very interesting and kind of less common work with that. But there is definitely kind of a split between, photography being photography most of the time and painting or drawing being those things.
So in your opinion, what is the relationship between illustration and the literary text? Do you think it's enhancing or detrimental to the imagination of the reader?
I personally think most of the time it's enhancing, but it certainly does depend on the situation and the individual. I agree with what Tim said, that it's very specific to what each person is experiencing. And I also like to usually have an encounter with the text before I would then want to explore other interpretations, because the text is the founding piece of the art, and it's the first creation. But I do think, and I've actually asked people this a few times, I've done like some little polls and just asked, on Instagram, do you personally think that illustrations expand your view of a world, or do they limit it? And most people said they thought it expanded. And I think partially that is due to the wonderful explosion of fan art and participation by fans in, the last, from the advent of the internet, really is when it truly took off. It definitely existed before that. But just because you know that there are so many different interpretations out there, I think that is like mentally broadening. And you know that any one interpretation is not the only interpretation. Film, I think, is a little bit more restrictive because there tend to be fewer different variations. There's usually, you know, one or two until you get to a point like Dracula or something, when films have been made about it for over 100 years, and then it's a little bit more broad, but it takes more time.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, or have you experienced that your paintings would bring people to actually exploring the literature you are inspired by, or in general, do you have any such experience?
I think I've had a few people say or approach me and interact with my art to some degree when they hadn't yet read The Lord of the Rings or something, or were in the middle of reading it, and so they were looking for, you know, things to inspire them while they read. But for the most part, I would say most of my interactions come from people who have loved Tolkien for a long time.
Yeah, maybe nowadays with the films out and everything around that, the huge publicity, it's not so obvious like in the time when Tolkien wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, maybe it's hard to say now.
Yeah.
And yeah, that I had included a similar question regarding the fan paraphernalia, like the necklaces or something like that. So maybe that the situation is similar. Some can buy just for that they like the visual of the thing, and even if they come across it by chance at some cons or something like that. And I believe that most others write it to really express their inspiration by the writer or the artists.
Mm-hmm. Most of the physical events I've done were for pretty Tolkien specific audiences. So I didn't have a lot of people coming up and wondering what something was or anything like that, but perhaps in a different situation that could happen.
Mm-hmm. There was another piece of information on your website, quote, "I see creativity as part of humanity's essence, a way we reflect the nature of God. I want my work to inspire others to create art too, in whatever form it might take." So this quote reminded me of what Tolkien described in his essay on fairy stories and the theory of sub-creation. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, that passage is certainly informed by Tolkien's theory of subcreation.
So you agree that artists should basically use their talents to explore the beauty of the world, as well as somehow use it for glorification of the creator or something like that?
Yeah, well, I think art should reflect your personal beliefs to some extent, whatever those happen to be. And I think that creativity is a very deeply set human instinct. And maybe each artist or person that's engaging with some sort of creativity is going to have some different reasons for doing what they do, and that's great. But for me, I did resonate pretty deeply with Tolkien's theory and idea about what creativity means, and how it does allow us to engage with the world around us, and perhaps with the spiritual, or what we cannot see, and just connects us to the sense of wonder that we have with the world at its best anyway.
Yes, exactly. It provides some kind of spice to our life that
yes.
bear scientific facts. Okay, and what about your dreams as an artist? Something that you would like to achieve in your life, and maybe in terms of collaboration?
Well, I certainly look forward to collaborating with more authors about and potentially illustrating their works, or at least creating cover designs. Because certainly depending on the type of work they're doing, they may choose whether or not to engage with more detailed illustration. And I do think that that's certainly the artist or the author's prerogative of how much they want their work to be illustrated in its published form. So I would love to do more of that. And the project I mentioned to you about maybe doing some illustrations for older stories like George MacDonald's work, I would love to do almost like a handcrafted book of that, where I print the book and my illustrations and hand bind it into like kind of a one of a kind work of art itself. So that's something that I'm keeping in mind for down the line. I'd love to do.
Okay, so good luck with that. And
Thank
my
you.
last question would be, who are artists who inspired you in your work?
Oh, so
Any
many.
artists you look up to?
Someone that comes to mind would be N.C. Wyeth, who was a Golden Age illustrator. He did a lot of illustrations for different children's books. There's so many illustrators from like the early 20th century that I really love. So N.C. Wyeth would be one. Oh, who else might I mention? My mind's kind of going blank now. Arthur Rackham is another. Kai Nielsen. There are many. That's a kind of a time period that I really love. And also the design work of William Morris, who was also rather influential on Tolkien, both as a writer and as a artist and designer. I love many of William Morris's patterns and decorative work. It's quite lovely. So that's someone else who stands out for me.
Thank you. Okay, so that's all for my questions. Maybe if we have some questions from the audience, either here in the classroom or those who are joined online, we have about 5 more minutes until the next presentation. So I really thank you both that you accepted this invitation and made our colloquium even more international than it already was. And yeah, now we can have
My
some
pleasure.
time for questions, either for Emily or for Tim. So it looks like they are either shy or tired already after the whole day. So yeah, I really thank you for your participation, and of course I will follow your art as well.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So, goodbye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.